All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic today that's pretty central, I think, to a lot of the changes we're seeing in pharma.
Yeah, it really is.
We talked a lot on the show about how medicines are made, and a lot of those conversations, we tend to touch on the older kind of traditional batch processes,
Right.
the way things have always been done. But
Sort of the tried and true, yeah.
there's this big, I don't know if you'd call it a sea change, but there's this big shift that's happening towards continuous manufacturing.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a big deal.
And with that, so many questions come up about
Absolutely.
how do you make sure that the quality of the medicines that are being made in this new continuous way are just as good, just as safe as the ones that we're used to?
Yeah, that's really the million-dollar question, right? I mean, you're changing the entire paradigm of how you're making these very important products.
Totally.
And so there's a lot of scrutiny on how do you make sure that the quality is maintained.
For our listeners, some of you are really deep in the weeds of pharmaceutical manufacturing, but a lot of you are just tuning in because you're curious.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe you've heard this term continuous manufacturing.
Uh-huh.
And you just want to wrap your head around like, okay, what does this mean for the quality of the medicines that I might eventually end up taking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the good news is that there are a lot of really smart people thinking about this problem.
That's good.
And that's what we're going to talk about today, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So for those who maybe need just a little refresher, right? The difference between continuous and batch is, used a good analogy before, like making a big pot of something. That's batch, right?
Right.
You do all these steps, you mix it all up, and then you test it at the end. Continuous is more like an assembly line where things are just flowing continuously.
Yeah. And so when we talk about quality and continuous manufacturing,
hmm
it's a whole different ballgame.
Right. It is. It is. So today, we're really going to focus on three key things. We're going to talk about real-time release testing, which is this really exciting area.
So wait, hold on. Real-time release testing, so like you're testing it as it's being made?
Exactly.
That's wild.
Exactly. So that's a huge change from waiting till the end to test it.
Right.
Then we're going to talk about PETE, process analytical technology, which is really the workhorse of real-time release testing.
Okay.
It's all the fancy sensors and instruments that allow you to measure things in real time. And then we'll talk about dynamic process monitoring,
Okay.
which is how you use all that data from PETE to actually control the process and make sure that it's running smoothly.
So we're talking about a lot of technology here. We're talking about a whole different way of thinking about quality.
We are, and that's what makes this so fascinating, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's not just about doing the same things we used to do, but faster. It's about doing them differently
Right.
and using technology to actually improve the quality.
Okay, so let's go back to basics for a second.
Sure.
Like, how was quality traditionally checked, I guess, in the context of batch manufacturing?
Yeah, so traditionally, and this is still done in many cases, you make your batch, like your big pot, you've cooked it up, you let it cool, and then you take a sample of that batch.
Okay.
You send it off to a lab, and you do all sorts of tests. You
Mm.
test for identity, for potency, for
Sure, like
purity.
all the things that are going to make sure it's safe and it does what it's supposed to do.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. You want to make sure there's no contaminants, it has the right amount of the drug, all of those things.
Okay.
And so that batch is essentially on hold
Oh, right, right.
while you're waiting for those test results to come back.
And that's kind of where the time lag comes in, right?
Exactly. And that's fine if you're doing batch manufacturing because everything's kind of stop and start anyway.
Right,
But when you move to continuous, you can't afford to have those hold times.
right, right. Because you're trying to keep this flow going. You can't just put everything on pause.
Exactly. Imagine an assembly line just stopping every few feet because you're waiting for a quality check.
Mm.
It would completely defeat the purpose.
So that's what makes this whole shift in quality control so crucial.
It is. And I think one of the key things we see in a lot of the sources is this idea of a structured approach to pharmaceutical development.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's essentially this idea that you're thinking about quality from the very beginning of the process
Oh.
and not just tacking it on at the end as an afterthought. So, drug development, from discovery to market, talks about this. And it really emphasizes that quality needs to be built into the very design of the manufacturing process.
So it's not just about checking the quality at the end. It's about designing a process that's inherently going to produce high quality.
Exactly. It's like, when you build a house, you don't just hope that it's going to be safe at the end.
Right.
You build it with safety codes in mind from the very beginning.
You have the inspector come in and check things along the way.
Exactly. And that's really the mindset shift that we're seeing with continuous manufacturing.
That's fascinating. Okay,
Yeah.
so this built-in quality, that sounds great in theory, but how does it actually work in practice?
Well, that's where this concept of real-time release testing, RTRT, comes in.
Right, we touched on that earlier.
Yeah, so instead of waiting till the very end to test the quality, you're doing it continuously throughout the process.
So you're basically taking measurements as the drug is being made.
Exactly. You're monitoring things like the concentration of the drug, the particle size, moisture content, all those critical quality attributes.
But how do you actually take those measurements in real time?
That's where PLET comes in, process analytical technology. And this is really a suite of tools, a toolbox, if you will,
Okay.
of various analytical techniques. So we're talking about things like spectroscopy, which uses light to analyze the chemical composition of a material,
Okay.
or chromatography, which can separate and identify different components of a mixture.
Right, right.
And then there are all sorts of sensors that can measure things like temperature, pressure, flow rate.
So you're basically building these sensors right into the manufacturing equipment.
Exactly. And the beauty of PAT is that it allows you to do all of this in real time without having to stop the process.
Right, because you can't take a sample out and send it off to the lab if you're trying to keep this continuous flow going.
Exactly. So PAT gives you this continuous stream of data about what's happening in the process.
So you're essentially watching the process unfold in real time, kind of like a live feed.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
And if something starts to go wrong, you can catch it immediately and hopefully correct it.
Precisely. And that's really the power of PAT, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about measuring things, it's about using those measurements to control the process.
Okay, so how does this real-time monitoring and control actually work in practice? Like,
Hmm.
what are you looking for?
So you're looking at those critical quality attributes, the CQAs that we mentioned earlier.
Right, the things that are essential to make sure that the medicine is safe and effective.
Exactly. So things like potency, which is the amount of the active ingredient,
Okay,
purity, making sure there's no contaminants,
right.
and then things like particle size and moisture content, which can affect how the drug dissolves and is absorbed in the body.
And all of these things can be monitored and controlled in real time using Kate.
Exactly. So you set up these control limits, right, for each CQA.
So basically a range that's acceptable.
Right. And as long as the measurements are staying within those limits, you know your process is running smoothly.
And if they start to drift outside of those limits,
That's when the alarms go off, and you know you need to take some action.
so it's like having these built-in safety nets all along the way.
Exactly. And that's a huge shift from the traditional approach where you only find out about problems at the very end.
Right, when it's potentially too late.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so with continuous manufacturing and PAT, you're really moving towards this idea of preventative quality control.
Okay, so you've got all these sensors, all this data coming in.
Right.
That must be a lot to handle, I imagine.
It is. And that's where data analytics comes in. And increasingly, artificial intelligence.
Oh, yeah. We've talked about AI a lot on this show.
And for good reason, right? Because these systems can handle huge amounts of data and actually make sense of it in a way that humans just can't.
So you're using AI to analyze all this data coming from the sensors and help you make decisions about the process.
Exactly. So, for example, AI can be used to identify trends in the data that might indicate a problem is developing.
Oh, wow. So even before it actually becomes a problem.
Exactly. So you can take corrective action before things go out of spec.
Okay, that's really powerful.
It is. And this is an area where AI is really starting to shine in pharmaceutical manufacturing.
So all of this new technology, this new way of thinking about quality,
Right.
what does it mean for the traditional quality control methods?
Mm-hmm.
Are they all just going to disappear?
It's a good question. And I think the answer is it's not a black and white situation. Some traditional methods are definitely being adapted for use in continuous manufacturing.
Okay.
So, for example, dissolution testing, which is a very common test to see how quickly a drug dissolves in the body.
Right, right.
That's now being done in line as the drug is being made.
Oh, wow.
So you don't have to take a sample out and do it offline.
That makes sense.
And content uniformity, which is making sure that each tablet or capsule has the same amount of drug.
Right.
That can also be monitored in real time now.
So it's not just that these tests are being done faster, it's that they're being integrated right into the manufacturing process.
Exactly. And that's a really important point.
Okay, so are there any traditional tests that are still going to be necessary even with all this new technology?
I think so.
Okay.
There are certain tests that are really hard to do in line,
Okay.
like stability testing, where you have to see how the drug holds up over time.
Right, right.
You can't really accelerate that.
And the regulators are still going to want to see those results, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's final release testing, where you do this really comprehensive analysis of the finished product to make sure it meets all the specifications.
So it's not a complete replacement, it's more like an evolution.
Exactly. It's about using the best tools for the job, whether they're traditional or new.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the technology, but what about the regulations?
Right.
Are the regulators on board with this whole continuous manufacturing thing?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think the answer is increasingly yes.
Good.
So the FDA, for example, has been very supportive of continuous manufacturing.
That's good to hear.
They see the potential benefits not just for efficiency, but also for quality.
Okay.
Because if you're doing things right, continuous manufacturing can actually lead to more consistent products.
Right, because you have so much more control over the process.
Exactly. And so the FDA has been putting out guidance documents and working with companies to help them implement continuous manufacturing in a way that meets all the regulatory requirements.
So it's not like they're just letting anything go. They're still holding companies to those same high standards.
Absolutely. And if anything, the standards are even higher in some cases.
Okay, why is that?
Because continuous manufacturing can be more complex.
Right.
And so you need a really robust quality management system in place to make sure that everything is under control.
And that's something that comes up in our sources a lot, right?
Yes, definitely.
The importance of a quality management system, or QMS.
Yes. And that's basically the framework that ensures that all aspects of quality are being addressed.
Okay.
So it covers things like documentation, training, deviation handling, risk management.
So it's not just about the technology, it's about having the right systems and procedures in place as well.
Exactly. And that's something that the regulators are really focused on.
Okay, so what about the starting materials?
Right.
The raw ingredients that go into making the drug?
Yes, the quality of the starting materials is absolutely crucial. And in continuous manufacturing, it's even more important because any variability in the starting materials can have a ripple effect throughout the whole process.
So you're basically amplifying any problems if you're not starting with high-quality materials.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of emphasis on having a really good understanding of your supply chain and making sure that your suppliers are meeting all the quality requirements.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different aspects of quality control in continuous manufacturing.
Right.
But I think it's important to circle back to one of the main reasons why companies are so interested in continuous manufacturing in the first place.
Yeah,
And that's the potential for faster cycle times.
exactly.
So how does all of this we've been talking about, how does it contribute to that?
So if you think about the traditional approach with batch manufacturing, there are all these hold times built into the process.
Right.
You're waiting for test results, you're transferring material from one step to the next.
Right.
And all of that takes time. But with continuous manufacturing, you're eliminating a lot of those hold times.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, you're doing a lot of the testing in real time, so you don't have to wait for those results.
Right.
And because the process is continuous, you're not having to stop and start all the time.
So the material is just flowing smoothly from one step to the next.
Exactly. And that can lead to some pretty significant time savings.
Okay, so what are some of the real-world benefits of these faster cycle times?
I think one of the most important is that it can potentially lead to faster delivery of medicines to patients.
Right, because if you can manufacture the drug faster, it can get to the people who need it sooner.
Exactly. And that can be a huge benefit, especially for patients with serious illnesses.
Absolutely. And I imagine there are also cost savings involved, right?
Definitely. So if you can manufacture the drug faster, you're using your equipment more efficiently, you're potentially reducing your inventory costs.
Right, because you're not having to store as much material for as long.
Exactly. And so all of that can contribute to lower manufacturing costs, which can ultimately benefit patients as well.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the theory and the technology.
Right.
But are there any real-world examples of companies actually doing this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the answer is it's still early days.
Okay.
Continuous manufacturing is really just starting to gain traction in the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay.
But there are definitely some companies that are leading the way.
Okay, like who?
Well, I'm not going to name any specific companies, but there are some big names out there that are investing heavily in continuous manufacturing.
Okay.
And they're starting to see some really promising results.
Okay, like what kind of results?
Well, for example, some companies are reporting that they've been able to reduce their manufacturing cycle times by as much as 50%.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. And that's not just a theoretical number, that's real-world data.
That's really impressive.
Yeah, and it really shows the potential of continuous manufacturing to transform the way that we make medicines.
So it's not just about making things faster, it's about making them better.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about this field.
Okay, so to wrap up today's deep dive, I think it's safe to say that continuous manufacturing is here to stay.
I think that's a pretty safe bet.
And it's really changing the way that we think about quality control.
It is. And it's all about being more proactive, more data-driven, and more focused on building quality into the process from the very beginning.
And ultimately, that's all good news for patients, right?
Absolutely. Because it means that we're going to have access to safer, more effective medicines that are produced more efficiently.
That's what it's all about.
And so as we see more and more companies adopting continuous manufacturing, it's going to be really interesting to see how this field continues to evolve.
Especially with AI and all of those advancements that we talked about.
Exactly. And so as we wrap up, here's a question for our listeners to ponder. As continuous manufacturing becomes more sophisticated and we start to rely more and more on AI to monitor and control the process, what's the role of human oversight? How do we ensure that we're not just turning everything over to machines? It's a really interesting ethical question, I think, that we need to be thinking about.
Definitely food for thought.
So,
And a good place for us to leave it for today. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
yeah, thanks, everyone.